The President Cyril Ramaphosa to officially open the Banapele Early Childhood Development Leadership Summit in Joburg. The sector looks after millions of children before they go to school. There are, though, around 1.3 million children who should be in these centres who are currently not enrolled in ECD centres. Daniel Peter Al-Naddaf is an attorney at the Equal Education Law Centre. Daniel, good morning to you and thank you for your time. We hear about our matric learners all the time. So often we don't hear much about what's happening to our younger children at ECD centres. Why is the sector almost so neglected?
Thank you so much for having me, firstly, Stephen, and good morning to everyone. I think there are a couple of reasons. The first is that for very long, ECD, or early childhood development, has often been seen as sort of a separate concern from the well-being of children more broadly. And we actually know that the opposite is true. In fact, the first 1,000 days of a child's life are some of the most crucial to their prosperity, to their well-being, and more to the point, to their ability to do well in their basic education, including in matric. But I think the second reason is because for a very long time, in part because of the market structure of ECD centres, which I'm sure we'll be able to chat about at some point, there has often been a neglect for funding of early childhood development services. And so for a very long time, the burden of providing those services has fallen not only to community members, but specifically to poor parents themselves, often paying for those services out of their child support grants.
There was a time, of course, when the ECD sector came under the Social Development Department, and during the pandemic, for example, they were just ignored. I think the minister at the time was Lindiwe Zulu. Was that as part of this sort of neglect, part of this because of the way government has treated the sector over the years? It does seem to have changed now.
Yes, unfortunately, that's certainly the case. And, you mentioned that it was until fairly recently under the Department of Social Development. There's now been a function shift, as I'm sure many people will know, for ECD primarily to the Department of Basic Education. There are some residual functions still held by DSD and DOH, for example. But absolutely, one of the crucial areas here of concern is not only neglect, in a budgeting sense and a structuring sense, but specifically in terms of an interdepartmental cooperation sense. And we're very encouraged by the fact that the Department of Basic Education has taken proactive steps to try rectify this. But exactly as you mentioned, there's about 3 decades of catching up that we have to do in the sector.
What kind of help does the sector need? What kind of support does it need? I mean, I presume it's not just government, obviously, but government's a major player here.
Yeah, so look, I suppose I'm going to sound very civil society when I say the first issue is funding, and we absolutely welcome in the most recent the March draft budget, essentially, there's been 10 billion rand earmarked for provisional allocation for ECD subsidies. And what that will allow us to do is restore the subsidy to its 2019 value, which has been frozen at 17 rand since then, and also to expand the ECD subsidies coverage to another 700,000 children, which, as you mentioned, is a significant number of the 1.3 million children who aren't currently enrolled in services. That's certainly not enough, and for proper provision of ECD services, we would need at least double that amount in subsidies, but it's a development we welcome. But the other really crucial development that's needed, and why I think that the Banapele Summit potentially holds a lot of promise, is we need a reconfiguration of the structures that oversee the ECD sector. There is a very, very needlessly complex and often onerous legislative and regulatory framework for ECD, and we're very encouraged by the DBE's moves towards trying to create a unified statutory framework for it. And secondly, as we'll see from BLSA or many other role players in the private sector, there's a lot of will and goodwill to invest in ECD from the private sector. But right now, one of the biggest obstacles to the private sector in doing so is that there is a very messy regulatory framework. And so, that sort of kind of cohesion is absolutely necessary for support.
On your pictures right now, you'll see, of course, the Basic Education Minister, Sivuyo Gwachube. She's speaking ahead of the President at this big event underway. How big, I mean, obviously the Basic Education Department now could make major changes. Is there an appetite for this? And I have to say, one of the problems you're likely to have is that the government has to set laws to keep young children safe. And young children need particular care, they need particular things. And so on the one level, you want to make sure, you want to legislate. We all want our children to be safe all the time. But the reality of South Africa, unfortunately, is that most of those centres wouldn't be able to comply with laws like that. So how do you strike the right balance?
I think you've touched on, at least for personally, my biggest issue with addressing this. So as you've mentioned, and I think maybe perhaps important to contextualize for the ECD sector, is that it looks very different from the rest of the basic education sector, in the sense that whereas the rest of basic education, the vast majority of schools are public schools, in the ECD sector, the vast majority are privately run, and predominantly in townships and rural locations. This is run predominantly by individual Black women. And one of the consequences of this is that, exactly as you mentioned, complying with statutory requirements, particularly with regards to safety, environmental compliance, is extremely expensive, especially where geological surveys are required. But what that also suggests to us is that that's one of the fundamental levers for enhancing accessibility to ECD services for young children, is not necessarily to say that we shouldn't have regulatory oversight, and not to say that we shouldn't have safety requirements, but that more support should be given to practitioners and to center owners to meet it. And there are two ways we can do this. The one is through a simplification of the regulatory process, which the latest Children's Amendment Bill has already aimed to do. And the second is to provide financial or in-kind support for people to comply. And I think that's a very important entry point, for example, from the private sector, who could be assisting centers rather than trying to, take over centers or have ownership of them, to assist them to comply with statutory requirements, that at the same time that we can ensure children are still accessing services, we know that a child, whether they're in a township, a rural area, or anywhere else, has the same level of safety as any other child would have.
Daniel, did you say that an ECD centre has to have a geological survey before they can actually build it? I can't remember such a... It's crazy.
Yes, and in a significant number of cases, yes. And one of the reasons centres are often required to do those surveys is where there's a potential that they're built on top of dolomite. And, it's not for me to say necessarily in each case whether it's necessary or not to be certain of the contents of the land that the centre is built on. But what I definitely can say is that the vast majority of centres are obviously not able to afford the many tens of thousands of rands that are necessary to provide this information to the state. And a very crucial entry point for enabling access is for the state to recognise the context of most ECD centres where they operate, and that by putting onerous obligations on centre owners and practitioners, you're not making children safer. In fact, the consequence is usually that these centres are forced to shut down and children don't get access at all.
Daniel, we in South Africa talk, there's the fundamental thing we need to do is we need to try and equalise opportunity for children, because our society is so unequal, right? You can't take away opportunity from richer children, and I think neither should you, I suppose. But in terms of trying to improve the matric outcomes, if I can call it that, for children from poorer families, how important is ECD to that? Let me put it another way. If we sort all this out, the President's speaking just now, the Basic Education Minister is on the stage at the moment, if we sort all of this out, in 20 years' time, would we start to see much better matric results from children who are growing up with very little?
Yes, I would argue that actually we would start to see better matric results even before then. But I take your point and I fully agree. There's a couple reasons. The one is, fundamentally the five key components of care that children need at that young age, whether we're speaking about nutrition, whether we're speaking about healthcare, development, early learning, are crucial building blocks to the kinds of learning that children do at a later stage. But perhaps even more specifically to the point, and to speak in terms of cost, it's significantly less expensive to proactively and preventatively look after children at a young age and to try address issues that happen down the line. And so, for example, if children are properly nourished and don't experience stunting, you save massive amounts of healthcare and education intervention costs down the line. If children are given access to proper early learning programs, including literacy and numeracy, the kinds of interventions that are frequently necessary in the FET phase, for example, won't be necessary, at least nowhere near to that level. And so we're talking not only about enhancing the ability for children to do well in schools, but we're also speaking about an economic saving because of the multiplier effect that ECD has. And so on both levels, it's not only a fundamental human rights issue, where from my side as civil society, I would strongly support, but it's also an economic case that we can't ignore. And that if we don't make those investments forward, we're setting ourselves up for a much higher debt down the line.
Daniel, thank you very much indeed. Daniel, Peter Al-Naddaf is an attorney at the Equal Education Law Centre. Well, standing on the stage at that event right now, the Basic Education